The medical officer of the Galactic Concordance research vessel Enlightened Pursuit had seen many species in her 40-year career. She had treated the crystalline Valkyrie whose bodies operated on principles of resonance rather than chemistry, had performed surgery on the triple-hearted Morvith whose circulatory systems would have made human engineers weep with their elegant redundancy, and had even managed to save a thought-shaper whose biology existed partially in dimensions human science couldn't properly measure. She considered herself unshockable, a professional who had encountered every variation of life the galaxy had to offer. Then she met her first human patient, and everything she thought she understood about biology, evolution, and the sheer stubborn refusal of life to follow sensible rules went directly out the airlock. The human's name was Marcus Webb, a construction engineer who had been working on the new trading station at Sigma Draconis when an accident with a plasma welder had sent him to the station's medical facility. The injury itself was straightforward enough, severe burns across his right arm and shoulder that would have killed most species through shock alone but had merely made the human swear creatively and walk himself to the medical bay. Dr. Shervara had taken one look at the damage and immediately prepared the regeneration pod, the standard treatment for catastrophic tissue loss that worked flawlessly on every known sapient species. She had explained the procedure to Marcus, assured him that he would be unconscious throughout the process and wake up fully healed in approximately 6 hours. The human had nodded, climbed into the pod, and Shervara had initiated the sequence with the confidence of someone who had performed this exact procedure thousands of times. 4 hours later, alarms began screaming across every monitor in the medical bay, and Shervara discovered that human biology didn't just break the rules, it actively seemed to take offense at them. The regeneration pod worked on a simple principle: it provided the optimal cellular environment for natural healing while dramatically accelerating the process through carefully calibrated growth factors and energy input. Every species responded slightly differently, but the basic mechanism remained constant. Except humans, apparently, didn't heal like normal species. The tissue wasn't just regenerating, it was regenerating wrong, growing in patterns that made no biological sense, creating structures that seemed to serve no purpose, and most alarmingly, generating massive amounts of heat that threatened to cook the patient alive. Shervara had emergency stopped the pod, extracted a semi-conscious Marcus, and spent the next 3 hours treating him with conventional methods while running every diagnostic scan her equipment could perform. The results had left her staring at her displays in utter bewilderment, convinced that either her instruments were malfunctioning or she had somehow encountered a species that evolution had designed as a practical joke. Humans, according to every test she ran, should not be possible. Their healing mechanisms operated on principles that seemed actively counterproductive, their immune systems appeared to be in constant low-level warfare with their own bodies, and their entire biological architecture looked like something that had been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything and had simply implemented every suggestion simultaneously regardless of whether they contradicted each other. Marcus's burns were healing, slowly and painfully, through a process that involved his body essentially attacking the damaged tissue, dissolving it, and rebuilding from scratch in a chaotic cascade of cellular activity that generated inflammation, fever, and what appeared to be a deliberately uncomfortable experience. When Shervara had asked Marcus why his species would evolve such an inefficient and painful healing mechanism, the human had simply shrugged his uninjured shoulder and said that was just how humans worked, as if the utter insanity of his biology was too mundane to warrant comment. Curiosity overtaking her professional reserve, Shervara had requested permission to perform a full biological study of her human patient, explaining to Marcus that his species was new to the Concordance and that understanding human physiology would help medical personnel across the galaxy provide better care. Marcus had agreed with the easygoing nature she was starting to recognize as characteristic of his species, joking that if his biology could contribute to science, at least his pain would serve a purpose beyond teaching him to respect plasma welders. Over the next 2 weeks, as Marcus's burns slowly healed through the brutal inefficiency of human regeneration, Shervara conducted the most thorough biological analysis of her career. Every test revealed new impossibilities, every scan uncovered fresh absurdities, and by the end of her research, Shervara had compiled a report that she knew would be dismissed as fiction by any xenobiologist who hadn't seen the evidence firsthand. She titled it Preliminary Analysis of Human Biology. A study in evolutionary contradiction, and marked it as urgent for distribution to all concordance medical facilities, because if other doctors were going to treat humans, they needed to understand exactly what kind of biological nightmare they were dealing with. The human immune system alone was enough to qualify the species as a medical anomaly worthy of intensive study. Most sapient species had evolved elegant defense mechanisms, targeted responses to pathogens that efficiently eliminated threats while minimizing collateral damage to the host organism. Humans had apparently decided that subtlety was for species that didn't evolve on death worlds, and had instead developed an immune system that operated on the principle of scorched earth warfare. When a human encountered a pathogen, their immune system didn't just target the invader, it carpet-bombed the entire area, raising the host's body temperature to levels that would damage their own tissues, flooding infection sites with cells that destroyed everything indiscriminately including healthy tissue, and generally treating the human body as an acceptable casualty in its war against microscopic invaders. The inflammation response that most species used as a mild signaling mechanism, humans employed as a primary weapon, deliberately swelling tissues, restricting blood flow, and causing pain that served no purpose except to make the human aware they were injured, as if the injury itself wasn't sufficient indication. Dr. Shervara's report on human biology circulated through the galactic concordance medical community like a virus, ironically enough, and the responses ranged from disbelief to horror to morbid fascination. She was invited to present her findings at the Concordance Institute of Xenobiology, a prestigious organization that brought together the galaxy's foremost experts on alien life. The amphitheater was packed with medical professionals, evolutionary biologists, and researchers from 36 species, all eager to hear about the humans who had recently joined galactic society and whose biology was apparently defying everything the scientific community thought they understood about how life should work. Shervara took the stage with her data compiled into a presentation that she had titled, with deliberate understatement, Human Biology. An overview of adaptive contradictions. She began with what she thought would be the least controversial finding, a simple analysis of human musculoskeletal structure, and within 10 minutes had the entire amphitheater in an uproar. The human skeletal system was a nightmare of engineering compromises that somehow resulted in a functional structure. Their spines, Shervara explained with diagrams that made several audience members wince, were essentially modified fish spines that had been repurposed for upright walking without proper redesign. The S-curve that humans carried in their backs was a structural weakness that caused chronic pain in a significant percentage of the population, served as a vulnerability in combat, and existed solely because evolution had taken a skeleton designed for horizontal movement and rotated it 90 degrees without bothering to optimize for the new orientation. Their knees, joints that bore the full weight of the human body during locomotion, were catastrophically over-engineered and simultaneously under-supported, consisting of a complex arrangement of bones, cartilage, and ligaments that worked beautifully in human youth and then systematically degraded over time as if the species had never evolved to live past reproductive age. A Morvath physician in the third row had interrupted to ask if humans were aware their basic architecture was fundamentally flawed, and Shervara had replied that yes, humans were quite aware, and they simply lived with chronic back pain and knee problems as normal aspects of existence. The muscular system was equally baffling in its contradictions. Humans possessed what Shervara termed explosive adaptation capacity, the ability to rapidly increase muscle mass and strength in response to stress in a way that most species required genetic modification to achieve. A human who regularly challenged their muscles would see significant growth in a matter of weeks, developing strength that seemed disproportionate to their base biology. But this same system was catastrophically inefficient at maintenance, requiring constant stimulus to prevent atrophy, meaning that humans who stopped exercising would rapidly lose their developed strength and return to a baseline that was frankly unimpressive by galactic standards. It was as if the human body had decided that any muscle not actively being used was a waste of resources and should be cannibalized immediately, a strategy that made sense for a species facing constant starvation but seemed bizarrely maladaptive for a civilization that had achieved food security millennia ago. When Shervara showed comparative scans of a human athlete versus a sedentary human, the difference in muscle mass and bone density was so dramatic that several audience members initially refused to believe they were looking at the same species. But the true horror of human biology revealed itself when Shervara began discussing their regenerative capabilities and damage response systems. She displayed the scans of Marcus Webb's healing burns, and the amphitheater fell silent as medical professionals who had spent lifetimes studying biology tried to comprehend what they were seeing. Human healing was not a process of careful cellular reconstruction, it was controlled destruction followed by chaotic rebuilding. The body identified damaged tissue and then attacked it with specialized cells that literally dissolved the injury, breaking down the damaged structures into component molecules while simultaneously flooding the area with growth factors that triggered rapid but disorganized cell division. The new tissue that formed was often inferior to the original, filled with scar tissue that lacked the flexibility and functionality of what it replaced, as if the human body was more concerned with filling the hole than with actually restoring proper function. A Valkyrie physician in the front row had asked why human healing would produce inferior replacement tissue, and Shervara had explained that it was apparently preferable to slow, careful regeneration because it allowed the human to return to activity faster, even if that activity was now impaired. The audience's reaction shifted from skepticism to genuine alarm when Shervara presented her findings on human pain tolerance and damage thresholds. Humans, she explained, had evolved on a world so hostile that their bodies had developed the ability to simply ignore catastrophic damage and continue functioning through what should be incapacitating injuries. She showed them medical records from human history, cases of individuals who had continued fighting after losing limbs, who had walked for hours on broken bones, who had survived injuries that would have killed any other known species through sheer refusal to acknowledge that they should be dead. The human pain response was present and functional. Humans felt agony just like any other species, but they possessed some psychological mechanism that allowed them to compartmentalize that pain and continue operating. It wasn't that they didn't hurt, it was that they had apparently evolved to simply not care about hurting if survival or duty demanded action. The implications were staggering and more than a little terrifying, because it suggested that humans had evolved in an environment so constantly dangerous that stopping when injured meant death, so their biology had simply eliminated stopping as an option. Shervara's presentation continued for another hour, covering respiratory systems that could function in atmospheres that would poison most species, digestive systems that could extract nutrition from an absurd variety of organic compounds including some that were technically toxic, and sensory systems that were individually mediocre but collectively created a surprisingly effective threat detection network. She discussed the human brain, an organ that consumed a ridiculous percentage of the body's energy budget and appeared to be significantly over-engineered for the tasks it performed, as if evolution had installed a military-grade processor in a civilian model and then found increasingly creative uses for the excess capacity. She explained how human brains were so energy-intensive that the species had evolved to enter a state of reduced consciousness for approximately one-third of every day, literally shutting down higher functions to conserve resources, a vulnerability that would be catastrophic for any species not at the top of their world's food chain. And she concluded with what she termed the most baffling aspect of human biology. Despite all these flaws, contradictions, and apparent design failures, humans were thriving, spreading across the galaxy, and proving remarkably difficult to kill even by species with far superior technology and more elegant biology. The questions that followed Shervara's presentation revealed a fundamental disconnect between how the galaxy's scientific community understood biology and how humans actually existed. A thought-shaper researcher, her form flickering with agitation, demanded to know how a species with such profound biological flaws could have achieved spaceflight before evolving solutions to their obvious design problems. Shervara's response was simple and deeply unsettling. Humans hadn't waited to evolve better biology because they had developed technology to compensate for their weaknesses faster than natural selection could fix them. Humans with bad eyesight created corrective lenses, humans with failing joints replaced them with artificial alternatives, humans whose bodies couldn't produce necessary chemicals simply synthesized them and introduced them externally. They had, in essence, hacked their own biology through applied science, addressing evolutionary failures with engineering solutions and never bothering to wonder if perhaps they should fix the underlying problems. This led to what became known in xenobiological circles as the human paradox. A species whose biology was riddled with flaws had achieved technological sophistication specifically because those flaws forced them to develop solutions. A Valkyrie evolutionary theorist proposed that humans had essentially bootstrapped their way to intelligence through medical necessity, developing sophisticated understanding of biology, chemistry, and engineering not from idle curiosity but from desperate need to keep their malfunctioning bodies alive. Human medicine wasn't an academic pursuit for them the way it was for longer-lived species with more robust biology. It was a survival imperative that had driven innovation for thousands of years. Every human culture had developed extensive pharmacological knowledge because humans needed constant chemical intervention to function optimally. Every human society had produced skilled surgeons because human biology required frequent mechanical repair. And every human civilization had prioritized medical research because the alternative was watching their people die from problems that more sensibly designed species never encountered. The discussion shifted to the military implications of human biology, a topic that made several peace-focused species visibly uncomfortable but which the Concordance security advisors followed with intense interest. If humans could continue fighting through injuries that would incapacitate other species, if their healing mechanisms prioritized speed over quality specifically to return them to combat faster, if their pain tolerance allowed them to ignore damage that should force disengagement, what did that mean for conflicts involving human combatants? A Morvath military observer who had attended the presentation provided sobering perspective from his own experience. His people had conducted joint training exercises with human marines, and the humans had terrified the Morvath soldiers not through superior technology or tactics but through their absolute refusal to accept defeat. In simulations, humans who had sustained simulated injuries that should have rendered them combat ineffective would simply acknowledge the damage and continue fighting, operating at reduced capacity rather than withdrawing as any sensible soldier would. The Morvath officer stated flatly that his people never wanted to face humans in actual combat because you couldn't rely on normal damage calculations, you had to assume that any human not literally dead was still a threat. But the most disturbing revelation came when Sharvara presented her findings on human environmental tolerances and adaptive capacity. Humans had evolved on a world they themselves classified as unusually hostile, a planet where extinction-level events occurred with disturbing regularity, where climate could shift dramatically within a single generation, where hundreds of thousands of species competed in a perpetual arms race of evolutionary one-upmanship. The result was a species with biology that wasn't optimized for any specific environment but rather could tolerate a shocking range of conditions. Humans could survive in temperatures that would freeze or cook most species, could function in atmospheric pressures that would crush or explosively decompress more fragile biology, could even endure brief exposure to hard vacuum and survive if retrieved quickly enough. Their bodies seemed designed not for thriving in any particular niche but for surviving anywhere, a generalist adaptation taken to such an extreme that it circled back to being a specialization in itself. Humans specialized in refusing to die regardless of circumstances. The adaptive capacity extended beyond mere survival to something more profound and unsettling. Humans could acclimatize to extreme environments in ways that seemed to involve real-time biological modification. Take a human to high altitude where oxygen was scarce, and within weeks their body would literally create more blood cells to compensate, increasing oxygen carrying capacity through sheer brute force overproduction. Expose a human to regular intense sunlight, and their skin would darken to protect against radiation, then lighten again when the exposure ceased, a dynamic defense mechanism that most species required genetic engineering to achieve. Subject humans to regular physical stress, and their bones would literally become denser, their tendons stronger, their entire structural system reinforcing itself against the perceived threat. It was as if human biology operated on the assumption that the environment was always trying to kill them and the only appropriate response was to rapidly modify themselves to survive it, consequences be damned. Sharvara concluded the scientific portion of her presentation with what she termed the human mortality paradox, and it was here that many audience members began to truly grasp the existential strangeness of human biology. Humans had relatively short lifespans compared to most spacefaring species, typically living only 70 to 90 standard years even with modern medicine, a fraction of what most sapient species enjoyed. But within that brief existence, humans packed an absurd amount of activity, learning, and accomplishment, as if their biology's many flaws had taught them that time was precious and shouldn't be wasted. More disturbingly, human bodies seem designed to function optimally for only the first third of their lifespan, with the remaining years characterized by progressive system failures, chronic conditions, and the slow breakdown of virtually every biological process. It was as if evolution had designed humans to reproduce, raise offspring to self-sufficiency, and then had simply stopped caring what happened to them afterward, leaving them to persist for decades with biology that was actively deteriorating. That humans had developed complex societies, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and respect for elders despite their own biology suggesting that survival past reproductive age was optional spoke to something profound about their psychology. The real paradigm shift came not from Shervara's formal presentation but from what happened afterward, when Marcus Webb himself was invited to address the assembly. The human had healed sufficiently from his burns to travel, though Shervara noted that he still moved with slight stiffness that would persist for months as his inferior scar tissue gradually remodeled itself. Marcus took the stage with an easy confidence that seemed at odds with being the subject of a presentation that had essentially catalogued everything wrong with his species' biology, and when he spoke, it was with a humor that many in the audience found disconcerting given the circumstances. He began by thanking Dr. Shervara for her thorough examination and noting that he had learned more about his own biology in the past 2 weeks than in 32 years of being human, which he suggested probably said something unflattering about human education systems. Then he addressed the core question that he knew was on everyone's mind: if human biology was such a disaster, how were humans not only surviving but thriving in galactic society? Marcus explained it in terms that made the assembled scientists uncomfortable precisely because they rang true. Human biology wasn't optimized for thriving, he said, it was optimized for not dying, and there was a crucial difference between those two states. Most species, he suggested, had evolved on worlds stable enough that their biology could specialize, could develop elegant solutions to specific challenges, could trade versatility for efficiency because their environment was predictable enough that such trade-offs made sense. Humans had evolved on a world that was actively hostile, where the environment could shift catastrophically within generations, where predators, prey, and diseases were constantly evolving new strategies, where survival meant being able to handle anything because you never knew what fresh horror was coming next. Human biology reflected that reality. It was a survival system built on redundancy, adaptability, and the stubborn refusal to optimize for any specific condition because that would mean vulnerability to everything else. The inefficiency of human healing, Marcus explained, made perfect sense when you understood that speed was more valuable than quality for a species that faced constant threats. A human with a wound that was healing slowly but perfectly was a human who was vulnerable during that healing period, potentially unable to flee predators or defend territory or gather food. A human whose body could rapidly seal a wound with inferior tissue was a human who could return to survival activities immediately, even if they now had reduced function in that area. Human biology had essentially decided that living with impairment was preferable to dying while healing properly, a brutal calculation that reflected the reality of evolution on Earth. The same logic applied to the human immune system's scorched earth tactics. Yes, inflammation and fever damaged the host, but they killed pathogens faster, and in an environment filled with novel diseases from thousands of competing species, fast response was worth the collateral damage. The chronic pain, the design flaws in the spine and knees, the rapid muscle atrophy, all of it made sense when Marcus explained that human biology had never evolved to support the lifestyles modern humans now lived. The human body was designed for a very specific existence. Childhood and adolescence spent developing survival skills, early adulthood focused on reproduction and raising offspring to self-sufficiency, and then a few decades of elder wisdom transfer before inevitable system failure and death. Humans were supposed to be moving constantly, covering dozens of kilometers daily in pursuit of food, engaging in regular physical conflict with predators and competitors, eating irregular meals of whatever could be caught or gathered, and generally living in a state of constant moderate stress that kept all their systems engaged. Modern human civilization had eliminated those pressures within just a few thousand years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, and human biology hadn't had time to adapt. The result was humans living in conditions their bodies weren't designed for, suffering from chronic conditions that arose from evolutionary mismatches, and compensating through technology and medicine for biology that expected a lifestyle no modern human actually lived. But Marcus's most profound point came when he addressed why humans didn't view their biological flaws as problems that needed fixing through genetic engineering, despite having the technology to do so. Several species in the audience had achieved biological perfection through careful genetic modification, eliminating hereditary diseases, optimizing system efficiency, and extending lifespans dramatically. Humans had that same technology now, but cultural resistance to widespread genetic modification remained strong, and Marcus explained why in terms that revealed something fundamental about human psychology. The flaws weren't just flaws, they were part of what made humans human, reminders of the world that had forged them, connections to ancestors who had survived despite those imperfections. More practically, humans had learned through hard experience that optimization often meant vulnerability, that a system engineered for perfection in one environment became catastrophically fragile when conditions changed. Human biology was messy, inefficient, and full of redundant systems, but that same messiness had allowed humans to survive everything from ice ages to disease pandemics to environmental catastrophes that would have wiped out more specialized species. Marcus concluded with an observation that left the amphitheater in contemplative silence. Human biology, he suggested, wasn't actually as flawed as it appeared when judged by the standards of species that had evolved in more forgiving environments. It was simply optimized for different priorities, not efficiency but resilience, not elegance but adaptability, not perfection but survival under any conditions. Humans had evolved to be the species that refused to die no matter what the universe threw at them, and if that meant living with chronic pain, inefficient healing, and bodies that started falling apart after a few decades, well, that was apparently an acceptable trade-off for the ability to colonize environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to orbital stations to alien worlds with minimal biological modification. The question wasn't what was wrong with human biology, Marcus suggested, the question was what kind of nightmarish evolutionary pressure created a species whose biology prioritized stubborn survival over every other consideration. And based on what the galaxy was learning about Earth, that was perhaps a question better left unexamined too closely. In the months following Marcus Webb's presentation, human biology became one of the most studied subjects in galactic xenobiology, with research stations across concordant space requesting human volunteers for various studies. The findings that emerged painted an increasingly complex picture of a species whose biology represented radical solutions to extreme evolutionary pressures. One particularly fascinating study examined human endurance capabilities and discovered something that explained a great deal about human persistence in pursuing goals. Humans possessed a cooling system, perspiration-based thermoregulation, that was essentially unique among sapient species and allowed them to maintain high activity levels in conditions that would force other species to rest. Combined with their efficient bipedal locomotion, this meant humans could literally chase prey animals to exhaustion, running for hours or even days until their targets collapsed from heat exhaustion while the humans simply kept coming, cooling themselves through evaporation and maintaining steady pace. It was pursuit-predation taken to an extreme, and it suggested that human determination and refusal to give up might be as much biological as psychological. The Concordance military took particular interest in these findings, not because they planned to fight humans but because they wanted to recruit them. Human Marines and security personnel began appearing on mixed-species vessels and installations, and their presence changed operational dynamics in ways that surprised even seasoned commanders. The human's ability to function through injuries, to maintain combat effectiveness in environmental extremes, to simply refuse to quit when any sensible species would withdraw, made them invaluable in crisis situations. But more than their physical capabilities, it was their psychological approach to problems that proved most valuable. Humans had evolved to see challenges not as insurmountable obstacles but as problems requiring creative solutions, a mindset born from biology that was constantly failing and requiring workarounds. Where other species might see a damaged system and wait for proper repair, humans would engineer a temporary fix and keep operating. Where other species might face an impossible situation and request assistance, humans would attempt solutions with whatever resources were available, often succeeding through sheer audacious refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. Dr. Sharvara published a follow-up study titled, Human Biology as Evolutionary Strategy, Optimization through Generalization, that became required reading in xenobiology programs across the concordance. In it, she proposed that human biology represented a fundamentally different approach to evolution than what most species had developed. Rather than evolving specialized solutions to environmental challenges, humans had evolved the capacity to develop technological and cultural solutions to any challenge, with their biology serving primarily to keep them alive long enough to figure those solutions out. Human intelligence itself might be less a product of social complexity or tool use and more a necessary adaptation to compensate for bodies that required constant problem-solving to keep functional. The human brain's massive energy consumption made sense if that brain was essentially running constant diagnostics and implementing fixes for biological systems that were always one failure away from catastrophic breakdown. This perspective reframed much of human culture and achievement in biological terms. Human medicine wasn't just advanced, it was advanced because humans needed it to be in order to survive their own biology. Human engineering emphasized redundancy and robustness because human engineers were themselves products of biological systems that prioritized those traits over efficiency. Human military doctrine focused on adaptability and resilience because those were the traits that had allowed their species to survive evolutionary pressures that would have eliminated more specialized species. Even human art and philosophy reflected biological reality, their cultural output filled with themes of persistence through suffering, triumph over adversity, and the nobility of continuing despite inevitable decline, all of which made perfect sense for a species whose biology guaranteed that life would be a struggle and death would come through progressive system failure rather than graceful decline. The galaxy's perspective on humans began to shift from seeing them as another species of roughly similar capability to recognizing them as survival specialists whose entire existence was optimized for refusing to die. This manifested in practical ways as humans found themselves recruited for the most dangerous positions across concordant space. Rescue operations in hostile environments, security details on frontier stations, exploratory missions to uncharted systems, anywhere that the job requirement could be summarized as survive conditions that would kill most species and accomplish the objective anyway. Humans didn't dominate these fields through superior technology or physical capability but through biology that had prepared them for exactly these scenarios, bodies that could tolerate extreme stress, minds that refused to accept failure, and a cultural understanding that sometimes survival meant pushing through pain and impairment because stopping wasn't an option. Other species could be taught these skills, could train themselves to operate under adverse conditions, but for humans it was simply baseline, the default state of existence for a species whose biology assumed the universe was hostile and acted accordingly. Perhaps the most profound shift came in how the medical community approached human patients. Initial attempts to treat humans with standard protocols had failed because those protocols assumed biology that operated on sensible principles. Doctors learned to work with human biology rather than against it, supporting the body's brutal but effective healing processes rather than trying to implement more elegant solutions that human systems would simply reject. They learned that human pain responses were informational rather than debilitating, that a human reporting severe pain might still be fully functional and shouldn't be automatically assumed to be incapacitated. They learned that human immune systems required careful management because those systems would happily destroy host tissue in pursuit of pathogens, and that human healing timelines were longer than other species not because humans healed slowly but because human bodies insisted on completely remodeling damaged areas rather than accepting patch jobs. Medical schools across the concordance added entire courses on human biology, not as a specialty but as a requirement, because humans were spreading throughout galactic society and every doctor would eventually encounter one. Marcus Webb eventually returned to construction work, his burns healed into extensive scarring that he wore with the casual indifference humans seem to have toward physical imperfection. Dr. Shrivara stayed in contact with him, occasionally requesting follow-up scans as his tissues continued their slow remodeling process, and through their conversations she gained deeper appreciation for what it meant to exist in a body that was constantly one failure away from serious problems. Marcus explained that humans lived with an awareness of biological fragility that most species never developed, that every human knew their body was a temporary construct that would inevitably break down, and that this awareness informed how humans approached life. You didn't wait for the perfect moment because there was no perfect moment, you didn't postpone living until conditions were ideal because your body was degrading every day, you simply did what you could with what you had and accepted that imperfection was inherent to existence. It was, Shrivara realized, a profound philosophy born from profound biological limitation, and it explained more about human achievement than any amount of physical capability analysis ever could. The final chapter of Shrivara's expanded study concluded with an observation that became something of a motto among xenobiologists studying humans: human biology wasn't wrong, it was adapted for a different set of priorities than what most species considered optimal. Humans had evolved to survive, to persist, to refuse extinction regardless of circumstances, and their biology reflected that single-minded focus. They healed inefficiently but quickly, fought through pain that should incapacitate, adapted to environmental extremes through brute force biological modification, and compensated for countless design flaws through technology and determination. They were, in essence, the galaxy specialists in not dying, a species whose every biological system was optimized around the principle that survival was worth any cost, any compromise, any amount of suffering. And in a galaxy that was discovering itself to be far more dangerous than the Concordance's centuries of peace had suggested, having a species around whose defining characteristic was stubborn refusal to accept death was starting to seem less like an evolutionary curiosity and more like exactly what galactic civilization needed. Human biology wasn't a disaster, it was a warning about the kind of world that could forge such adaptations, and a promise that whatever challenges the galaxy faced, humans would be there, unkillable and unwilling to quit, compensating for their flaws through sheer determination to survive.